And as per usual, I'll have to unmute again to actually keep talking.
Yeah. So starting it off again, I have no clue. What are we doing here today?
Well, Tyler was going to answer Andrew's question about the webinar, and then I'll briefly explain what I had in mind to talk about. Welcome back to Season 2 of OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. It's a bunch of returning members this time around, so that's really, really great. Starting up, Lance, how you been?
Oh, well, really, really well. I'm Lance Lamont. I lead the Special Projects and Protocols team within the research group here at Verve.
Oh, that's right. They changed your title recently.
Oh, yeah. Good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe keeping then with the theme of title changes, Drew is back as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking mine up right now. It seems that I'm Andrew Wintermeyer, and I lead the device and integration team here at Verve.
That is right. So before, we've talked previously about like device research on the podcast, and essentially they have taken that research group and sort of broken it up into two different specializations. Lance heading one, and Drew getting a bump up, heading the other.
Yep, he's going to do a great job.
Mm-hmm. All righty. And Tyler is also back.
Hey, thanks for having me back. So I'm still over here leading the team for the foray out there to sites and everything. So pleasure being back.
Mm-hmm. And lurking there in the background, we have Rick Herzing.
Hello, my name's Rick Herzing. I'm a Verve OT systems support analyst, and I have the pleasure of working with all these gentlemen directly, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, that you do. And I continue to be Kenneth Kully, systems support lead at Verve Industrial, and still running the podcast, at least for the time being. Yeah. And so what I thought to kick off season 2, some of this kind of came out of chatting with Megan and Sally about like, do we want to do a season 2? There's certainly support from the marketing side, but it was, a question of, well, how do we start? And so I thought, and this is why I say, like, Lance, you might be peanut gallerying more than anything. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about not necessarily like a full deployment, but like once you're in an environment, how do you go about safely finding and inventorying assets?
I definitely want to hear all about this. This is a fascinating topic.
All right. Well, let's kick it off.
Yeah, it's kind of a brand new world over here at Rockwell. I mean, we're getting integrated in, got new ways of entering time and all that other crazy stuff, and figuring out how to do like sick time and holidays and all this other crazy stuff. There's a ton to navigate out here. And I think a lot of us are getting kind of lost in some of the day-to-day interaction, and then trying to stick around with our day jobs over here with, keeping the wheels going.
Now, what is the core functionality that we do as the Verve organization? What do we do when we get to that customer site? And Tyler, I've never been to a customer site. So what's it like? What happens? How do you establish the trust that you can go on the network, and how do we identify those devices?
Oh, those are two different questions.
Very different, I know. But.
Yeah, that's pretty black and white over there. So, a lot of times, like, for me, when I'm going on site, it's because I spent a lot of background in the ICS. I know a lot of us within an organization have spent multiple different years within different facilities, whether it's manufacturing or power production or power delivery or other little various verticals out there. We just have this like innate knowledge of control systems. And I think that's what really gets a lot of the interest of, like, when you walk into a plant and Bob, our founder, he's one of the more oblivious out there. Like, when they walk into plants, like, yeah, we're OT, we're not IT. And he's pretty blatant about that when he's talking about that, because, there's always been this stereotypical rift between IT and OT out there, right? So you kind of got to set some of that bearing out there where you'll talk up the controls guys. It's like, hey, did you know that RS Logix is getting deprecated out? Or like, I see you got this Fanuc controller over here. How are you guys getting around that since it's like, 10 years out of date and everything like that? So it's just kind of talking shop with some of these guys, and you build a little bit of that rapport with them. And, as soon as you come in and you're starting to talk in the same language, you're like, oh yeah, well, here's the drawer with all the drawings and the Post-it notes with all the passwords for everything, go have a good time. And it's very stereotypical because, it's not like some of these IT nuances are new to them. They're really not. They haven't been given a lot of credence with being able to, keep an accurate inventory over time because, you get like this one-time Excel spreadsheet, and by the time you get done filling it out, it's already, old. So that's kind of the real shiny gem that we show these operational folks when we're walking the doors. Like, hey, we've got this product. It'll connect to all your assets. It'll tell you about everything you ever want to know about these assets out here. So you don't have to keep these spreadsheets updated all the time, and they just kind of get this bright look in their eyes and they're like, oh my gosh, take my money type of situation,
Well, it sounds like part of that, though, is us proving that we know the environment, that we're not going to go in there and just, we're going to send loads of data over your OT network. It's being able to prove that not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. We've been in there. We know how to keep their network up, even when we're doing these additional things and minimizing the amount of load on the network, right?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of that comes with that initial site walk down. Like you're going in there with the controls engineers and they're showing you around and showing you where all the bodies are, right? Sure. So, by being, controls guys by, olden days and everything like that, we're walking through it with them and we're just kind of pointing out stuff to them. It's like, hey, I see you have an ABB system over here, but you're running some Rockwell PLCs over here. Are you doing like Modbus tags or, how are you doing communications on her? So you try to do some probing questions around that leads around how their setup is. And it may be some things that they don't intrinsically know either. So it's kind of couple faceted. So you're building that rapport with the guy. Plus, you're also trying to like glean some intelligence in regards to how their ecosystem is set up to know, well, how much of a pain is this going to be to set up our ecosystem to be able to get through and identify these assets and things of that nature. So that is a lot of proof in the pudding with going around, doing an initial site walk down. You can kind of see where all the dead bodies are at. The PLC 5 that's tucked in the corner that's plugged into an Ethernet cable and things of that nature. And then kind of getting a real known layout of it, because a lot of these OT guys, the olden state philosophy, and I'm guilty of it too, because I'm back in the old days of where, if it's not broke, don't fix it type of thing. So you get these systems that are running for like 15, 20 years. Nobody really knows the wiser of them and everything until you go to look at them. And then everybody's like, don't look at it, you'll break it type of thing. Sure. So it happens.
So on the initial site walk, you're obviously walking around, seeing things. I know the people that work there every day are obviously really aware of their networks, but do you ever get interesting discoveries that are like, oh my goodness, we didn't realize this was there or this was set up that way?
On the occasion, yeah.
Seen it happen.
Yeah, it probably more often than not. So, I was talking about in the webinar where we're talking about like network segmentation and things of that nature. So a lot of times the OT folks will think that, Ethernet is just another field bus where I can just plug anything into it and it's just going to work. They don't have a lot of significant knowledge on VLANs and segmentation and things of that nature, or if a port would be turned off or things of that nature. So that's kind of like some of the nuances that is like almost stereotypically IT driven a lot of times. So what I've found multiple different occasions now is where they'll bridge VLANs, or they'll be using their corporate LAN for some type of a pass-through traffic, multiple layer 3 network segments on a single VLAN. It's all those kind of nuances and findings out there. So it kind of becomes multifaceted when you're trying to peel apart the onion, right?
Sure.
And that's kind of where our consultancy side comes into play beyond just Verve as a product, right? Because we can, semi-intelligently go in there and say, hey, you've got a potential issue here. You might want to think about detaching this and giving a different path, maybe some, different usage of fiber or things of that nature. Trying to kind of help highlight some of those easy wins that'll help make it more efficient or better operate out there. Like one of the examples of the plant that I was just talking about that they were using the corporate VLAN for transport, they were totally oblivious to it. And they just thought that everything was all carved out like it should be, but it really wasn't. And we were able to offer up some help there, give them a little bit of a ground plan for building out some additional fiber for connectivity just to the DCS system while segmenting off the corporate network. Because this was actually a part of a larger product of not only installing Verve as a product, but we're also doing backups, application whitelisting, as well as like network segmentation services for their systems that they had out there. So the larger systems was, this was a power production facility. So you had your DCS system, which was basically all of the power production components proper on their own network. And then you had the continuous emissions monitoring, which was sitting on the corporate network as it was. But the intent is to, we're going to carve out another network all by itself. That's all going to be for the SIMs, the continuous emission monitoring systems. So that way they can have their own traffic out there and be less of a vulnerable footprint out there. So it's like reducing your security footprint out there to be less than what it was, because they had these devices that were sitting on a corporate network. I could get on to anybody's workstation on the corporate side and get into the SIMS devices right offhand. I'm like, yeah, that's not a good thing, guys. So that they recognize that, and they hired us as an effort to do that at their facilities that they had that at.
Nice. Awesome.
Tyler, what can you tell me about this webinar?
So we were invited to do this webinar of 2025 OT cybersecurity trends and predictions. So it's kind of like our kind of cover all out there of what we're kind of seeing out there. Natalie covered a lot of the regulatory stuff that's coming around. So NIS2, some of the other things that Rockwell is working on as a whole for 62443, as well as I think Zach also covered some stuff within the water sector with some kind of nuances that's coming in the pipeline over there. So it was a lot of interest in some of the nuances in the regulatory, but then we started going into kind of a sidetrack of, what are we seeing that's net new in these environments? So like the adoption of cloud, any type of adoption of AI, where we see AI might be utilized within the ICS environments to help out different things and things of that nature. I'm just kind of looking at it as another tool in the toolbox, but in trying to kind of philosophically roll around in my head, it's like, well, where would that be a good fit, But anyway, I digress from that.
Okay, so we're doing the first walkthrough. We're talking with them. We're identifying the potential network updates and things. What's next? What's the next step? When do we start installing software? When do we start discovering new devices? How does that work?
Well, stereotypically you have your initial ingress, right? So you have that engineering workstation out there that's attached to the DCS network, has visibility, everything out there. We'll install our agent on there, and then we'll issue our, mild sweep that we have to identify all the assets on typically a very flat network. And then once we pull all those in, we'll recognize them. We'll load the ones that we have drivers for. We'll get all the identifying information for the devices that we don't have drivers for. And then we'll just sit there and let it cook. And then and see if there's any net new that comes on or leaves or anything of that. So that kind of comes into the stereotypical lifecycle servicing of our platform as far as identifying net new or changes within the ecosystem, right? So like new devices, maybe you have a transient laptop that comes on there and goes off. We'll recognize that. It'll still be out there as a line item, and maybe that is one that they want to ingest into our ecosystem so they can have monitoring on it whenever it hits the network too. So that's one of the stereotypical affronts that we'll do within that. Within this particular customer too that I'm talking about, we also did application whitelisting, which it's kind of a contra to antivirus. And whereas it doesn't have a lot to do with virus signatures or anything of that. So application whitelisting is a little bit of the opposite. It'll take the running state of the DCS system and we'll end up whitelisting all the applications that are currently running out there, because DCS systems are fairly static in the applications they run and things of that nature. So once you identify all those over a period of time, then you just flip the switch on your application whitelisting, and anything net new will come up as a pop-up on, hey, do you want to run this? And then it sends it to the server administrator for approval before it's actually allowed to locally run, or you can approve it globally within the fleet as well, versus just run local.
Right.
So a little bit better, because then you're not updating things that are all the time within regards to definitions and things of that nature. It's a very, very controlled baseline state.
Nice.
So, I don't know, Lance, you've kind of just been driving this whole conversation. But I think actually works because, you're asking questions as like sort of the genuine outsider, because within Verve, like this isn't part of the process that you normally deal with. We come to you after the fact when we need like those drivers that Tyler mentioned.
Right. Yeah.
And you head up the research part.
Yeah, Tyler mentioned we identify a device we don't have a driver for, and then we gather the information. That's where Drew and I start our adventure, right? We get a message from you or Tyler, or actually a task request, support request, and we take that through and we do all the work to identify how to safely communicate with that device, how to gather all of the pertinent properties from that device in a controlled and minimal network impact manner, identify vulnerabilities, all those sorts of things. And then we obviously provide a new updated driver to you. But the amount of time I get to be on the front lines interacting with the customers, seeing their networks and things is very rare. So I'm really enjoying learning all of these things. So thank you, Tyler.
Yeah,
I think maybe we should dig into the identify portion a little bit, which is kind of where the kernel of the idea for this episode started in my mind. Was literally like, okay, like we've put VAM and we've put BigFix into a customer network. How do we actually go about like wandering through and finding things? It's all well and good to say identify, but what's actually behind that word? Because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, you're definitely right, Ken. So, I mean, there's the stereotypical stuff that we see all the time. We've got a very large Rockwell driver base for all the Ethernet IP stuff. And it kind of comes down to the driver components out there that we have. So Ethernet IP, when it was initially built, was built with the construct that devices could inherently share identifying attributes of themselves within the protocol itself. So that made it phenomenal when you're going out there and trying to collect devices that'll actually respond on Ethernet IP. Now, all of us on here can know and agree that, not everything out there responds to just Ethernet IP. You've got a multitude of other different field protocols out there that devices will respond to, or they have their own inherent build of, native management applications out there. Web, Telnet, Secure Shell, things of that nature. And that's where you, Lance and Drew, come up with a lot of the magic in the background to how to interact with some of those devices by knowing, the device family that comes back, what it's expecting as far as, interaction to those devices, and then peeling back the layers that is around the management interface in there, whether it's a Secure Shell, web. Does it remain consistent from firmware to firmware as well, which is also kind of a nuance out there that we've seen amongst other things. There's also a lot to do with some of the other protocols that are out there that, I think people also try to gravitate towards that, we should be able to get an abundance of information off of these devices. Well, a lot of times it's not true because you get into protocols like Modbus, which has been primarily just data traffic. And depending on the vendor implementation of that protocol, it may or may not bring back all the cheddar for those devices. Or, like I said earlier, different firmware variations of that same model. The Modbus registers change over time within the makeup of it. So you have to do this extraordinarily amount of research to be able to talk to a device over Modbus and be able to get that initial firmware grab on it before you can go back there and get more identifying attributes for that device. So I really got to hand it to you guys. You guys do a hell of a job out there with that driver development.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I have a whole team, or Drew and I have two full teams of people that are absolutely fascinated by protocols and just digging in and figuring out what's going on. And it's very interesting in the OT space. Like you mentioned, Ethernet IP is a very nice protocol for gathering information for the device discovery aspect of things. But many of the protocols are much more focused on, okay, we're already connected to this device. How do we gather current status information from the device? What's the temperature? What's the, what stage of this process are we in? And some of these protocols have no concept of identifying which device it is. They just assume that you're talking to the device and you must know what it is. But we try to gather as much information from each device as we can, regardless of how we talk to it.
Well, and even before we get to the information gathering stage, there's that whole process of actually like finding the device, because it's one thing to actually establish presence in the client network. But once you're there, it's the challenge of actually finding what's around you. Now, I mean, if you're lucky, you're going into an engagement where the client has reasonably decent documentation, and so you kind of have a good sense for the lay of the land. If you've been able to do a facility walk down, you have an even better sense for the lay of the land and what's actually out there on the network. Tyler mentioned like spotting, oh, you're running ABB, but there's a Rockwell PC over there, right? If you actually have a chance to put eyes on things, that's wonderful. If you're going in blind and you have very little documentation about what's on the network because, the client is like, well, that's why I'm bringing you in, because I need an inventory of my network. I need to know what's out there. Then it can be more challenging because
chicken and the egg.
Well, chicken and the egg, but also like, again, and going back to what we said at the start, right? Like you can't just go in banging around with, a high intensity Nmap scan. You can't just like fire up Angry IP Scanner, turn on all the features and hope for the best. You have to be able to approach it with a sensitivity. Now, to be fair, VAM and BigFix and the way that we configure them do give us a way to have some of that visibility in that reasonably sensitive way. Whether it's like if you put a BigFix client on an endpoint, of course, first you have to know that there's an endpoint there, but if they can even give you a single endpoint that they're reasonably sure exists and you can connect to it and put something like a BigFix agent on it, well, now you have the ability to, you can start using it to do constrained looks around the network, see what ports are listening on other devices. Or if you don't even want to be that aggressive, then you can at least start sniffing passive traffic, right? You can pull the ARP table off of the device and VAM can ingest that and can start to identify other addresses that are talking on the network. And it's that whole process of, basically finding an asset, finding a couple of assets. PCs are great because, of course, with something like the BigFix agent or, Verve agent, as its capabilities continue to grow, we can use an endpoint to do a lot of work, a lot of discovery work. Again, we can sort of do some lightweight active querying of a network, look for specific ports that might be listening on other devices. We can grab MAC addresses, which allows us to have a rough idea of who the vendor is. Doesn't always 100% align. For example, a Dell server with multiple NIC cards installed. Well, those could be Broadcom cards, and they'll show up as Broadcom when you actually look at the discovery results, but they are, ultimately secondary NIC cards plugged into the back of a server. Same with an HP. You can get addresses, you can get, just little bits of data. But the point is, you can actually see what that other asset can see. Switches are another really great resource for this. If we can connect to a switch or a couple of switches, then again, we can't run like Verve Agent or BigFix Agent off of a switch. So we don't have sort of the more active, what ports are you listening on? But again, we're going to be able to get an ARP table. We're going to be able to, and switches see a lot of network traffic. So we're going to be able to get a good sense for what else is out there, what else is talking out there. And as you start to see those results come in, then of course you can have that back and forth with the client. Okay, what sorts of devices might be running like within this address segment? What are these devices here? The nice thing about having the port data is that kind of enables us to do some additional triage when we want to go back to the client with these questions. If we see 3389 listening on a handful of devices, or 135, 445, if we see those TCP ports listening on a handful of devices, you can almost be certain that it's going to be a Windows endpoint. There's like one or two other weird edge case devices that I've seen like once where they're like essentially mirroring 3389 and 445 for something behind them. But in general, if you're going to see those ports, you're going to see it. Those are going to be like your Windows endpoints. And that's great. Now, all of a sudden, we're finding like maybe that's an engineering workstation over there. Maybe that's an operator workstation over there. Maybe that's a server over there. If you see, port TCP 443, TCP 80, cool. We got some kind of web server running over there. Even if I don't know anything else about the device and neither does the client, maybe if I have, the ability to be on that same subnet and bring up some kind of web browser, or maybe I'll just run a curl command from them, I can start, I can connect and I can pull back a little bit of information and I can see, it's an SEL device, or it's some kind of Schneider device that has, a simple web server, and it's, got just some basic information for me that I can, and then I can go back and I can say, maybe this driver will run against it. But it's that whole process of, getting that initial presence, getting those couple of initial points that you can start to collect data from, and then actually collecting the data and letting them ingest the data, and then working through the data to try and figure out, okay, what are each of these things now that I am seeing coming up, and how do we handle each of them in turn? Do we need to put some kind of agent on them? Do we need to connect them to a driver?
Yeah, that's 100% gold out there, Ken. So, stereotypically, when we go into an environment and we have that OS asset out there initially, it's also going to get that port information too. So if it's like a complete unknown embedded device to us, but it's showing like a port 80 on it, I'm going to bring up a web browser and try to get a splash screen off of it and see what it kind of gives me, some type of cheddar around it, and go from there. So it's trying to kind of dig around, what is it currently presenting to us that we could use to identify without engaging one of the local SMEs to say, hey, I've got this device out here and it's shown up as a Fukushima or something to that for a MAC address. There's times where MAC address isn't always enough to be able to identify devices.
No, not at all. But it's better than nothing.
Mm-hmm. If it's the only thing to go on, that's the only thing to go on, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you don't even have that. You just have an IP address, because there are, you can go to, there's all sorts of like MAC address vendor lookups. And VAM ships with its own lookup database, essentially. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I have this MAC address, the first 3 octets are this, that's going to be VMware. The first 3 octets are this, that's going to be Dell. And there's whole reserved blocks that are kind of just... Now, it gets a little bit murky in the OT space, because Bentley, Nevada is kind of my favorite one to point to here, because, they've changed hands a few times. And so sometimes what comes up as, Emerson is technically actually a Bentley, Nevada device, or GE Fanuc's another one that, again, that changed hands. The block reservation, the MAC address block reservation, happened while Fanuc was a GE product, but they're not a GE product anymore. I think Emerson owns them too, actually. So, or maybe they've been spun off again into their own thing. I can't even remember. This stuff changes, but the registries don't necessarily get updated. And so when you see something come up on the driver, sometimes it is what it is. And sometimes it says it's one thing, but in reality, we have to connect a totally different driver to it that you wouldn't necessarily expect first, which is why you do have to go back to have that conversation with the customer. But at least you're pulling a MAC address in those cases. There's been times where, and some MAC address blocks are unknown. So there's been times where I'll see devices where we don't get a return back off the block because it's not in a portion of the MAC address registry that is tied to a particular vendor. And sometimes we just don't even pull back a MAC address. And then it's like, well, something's out there and this is its address. What is it?
Or it's a vendor that's a wholesale supplier of like networking components that's used between 3 different major vendors out there too. That gets hairy.
Yeah, we've run into that before just on the research side of things where we've had stuff come back from the field. I believe we lost a couple of months tracking down something that was the NIC was coming back as DMP computers or something like that. And we ended up looking into it. Finally, we got a picture from the site, from the device that they were looking at. And it was actually a Teledyne analyzer for what was it, like the pollution control. It was checking how much oxygen was in this one tower. And so they were just using NICs from another manufacturer, probably made the network cards for them or something like that. I did have a question while you were bringing all of this up, like all of the stuff that you see on plant, or sometimes when you have to go in without a crystal clear map of what the environment looks like. You're feeling around on the network, and I understand that your tools are kind of truncated a little bit. You're not using Nmap, you're not using Ngri IP. So you're feeling around on the network. You notice maybe you're not connecting to a certain area, or maybe like the certain row of workstations isn't replying back, and you have to go and you start making changes on the network just to get the communication moving around, and you have to make a station be a relay. You're doing this and you're asking for creds for all of these different systems while you're setting this up for them. Does the site manager ever give you a look while you're making these changes, like, oh, I hope you know what you're doing?
So stereotypically, so the ICS guys are one story. Like you talk to them for 10 minutes and they're pretty kosher with you. But like the facilities manager, like the top guy for the site, that's probably the one to get the most buy-in from, because stereotypically, by and large, they are very, very reserved of changing anything within the environment.
Well, you said they haven't shut it down for 15 years. Jerry doesn't work here anymore. He set it up. So what are we going to do?
Yeah, there's a lot of that too. So, like facility managers, I mean, you almost have to be like, you have to fill forms out in triplicate just to say like, hey, we're going to do this. It's not going to harm your stuff, and this is exactly what we're going to do out there. In some cases, I've had very, very large deltas between facility managers and what they'll allow you to do and what not allowed you to do. It just kind of depends on kind of the flavor of the day with some of them sometimes, and depends on stereotypically what is kind of they being held to some very high stipulations or anything of that nature. So like oh gosh, this one facility manager, we were changing something on the IT side that was going to be very not even remotely a part of the DCS system, and he just needed some extra hand holding to just say, hey, this is what we're doing. It's happening on the IT side, zero impact whatsoever on the DCS side, and if it makes you feel any better, I will go over and physically unplug the DCS from any of this equipment to make sure that it has absolutely zero impact on anything. So that's when we were doing network segmentation facilities. But when we're doing like I think what you're talking about is our agent relay configuration out there.
Oh, for sure.
We have to get to like islanded networks and things of that nature. So that's a little bit of an easier story. And a lot of times the facility manager isn't, too interested in what we're doing when it comes to that level. But typically it's just a conversation we'll have with like the local ICS folks and just say, hey, we've got this workstation. It's got access to 3 different distinct networks. One of them is completely isolated as well, meaning that it's no routing to anywhere else in the plant except through that workstation. And that's our only ingress and to be able to pick up like any of that independent devices that are out there. Stereotypically, that's like your turbine controllers that are out there. The big stuff that monitors for vibration on your steam generation turbine. Make sure it's not like trying to shake itself apart. And it's got full capabilities of tripping the plant off if it does something ignorant. So that's the one that to get a little bit more puckered up about.
I can understand that.
Types,
Sure.
So we just got to approach that really diligently at the time that we go to onboard those things out there. And it's just kind of knowing where those different discrete systems sit out there. Because when you're walking into a facility, even though it may be one large flat network, stereotypically, a lot of times they set them all up as static IP addresses. So you'll have like this block for water, this block for turbine control, this block for SIMs, things of that nature, if they're not already segmented out to be on separate networks too. So it's a barrage out there.
Well, and this is why it's important to, have those to have those face-to-face meetings. And this is actually one of the reasons why, like, every time the topic of training comes up, when I'm talking to, people higher up the org chart from me, I mean, yeah, obviously we want to be onboarding people with OT experience and with the technical chops to do the work and to do it well and to do it relatively unsupervised. Like, we want people who are knowledgeable and able to fly on their own. Absolutely. But I almost never wind up talking about that. I almost always wind up talking about soft skills because at the end of the day, you're right. Like, whether it's the controls engineer or the site manager or whoever, and I mean, hopefully the sales team has done some good work at the front end of this to really build up confidence in Verve as an entity in the minds of whoever we're having this engagement with. But at some point, the rubber does meet the road. We have to put an analyst in front of the client, and that person does need some soft skills. We need people who can also people, is what I keep saying. Because it's all well and good to have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't talk to the person in front of you who has some real reservations about handing you, a person that he's literally known for an hour, the keys to the kingdom, you need to be able to present yourself, present your knowledge, but also just speak to the person. It's not just about the tech, it's about the other person. You need to be able to speak to them and where they're at, not just intellectually, but emotionally a little bit, at any rate, to actually make them feel at least a little bit at home with the idea of giving you and your software some pretty high privilege access to the environment. And it's a very sensitive environment. So that's kind of why I always keep emphasizing, I need some soft skills. I need people with soft skills too. Knowledgeable, yes. Technical, yes. And able to actually interact with other human beings who maybe aren't necessarily as knowledgeable or as technical as they. And sometimes that's a big ask.
There. Yeah,
sometimes it's a bit of an ask.
You're managing the customer's expectation while you're also troubleshooting and probably at certain times crossing your fingers, hoping that this connection works the way that you expect it to, and all of that. Because I'm sure you're looking at things and working through configurations, and you're probably retrying different ports and all kinds of different things to try to make different drivers work and different configurations. Like you're trying to go through like a serial gateway to get something behind that. So there's a complicated jump there, and the driver's not working out, and you have that customer right behind you, so you're not looking at the documentation like in your own lab setup, or you're in a class scenario where you can just kind of read through the documentation and be like, oh man, why isn't this working? Well, you have to be able to talk about the product and act like this is all expected and keep your calm. So yeah, that's a certain kind of character.
It is. Yeah. And that's just being on site. One of the realizations that I've made, and This is just within the last couple of years. And it's because we talk to so many people throughout the life cycle of our product. The thing that really drove it home to me was when we were up at Milwaukee, and we had this exercise, and it was about talking about the different personas you're interacting with. And that really struck it home with me at that time. So, just as a thought exercise, I'll throw it out there. We work with a multitude of different people when it comes to our product as a whole, because you have not only the ICS engineer who you're trying to get shoulder to shoulder with to show you around to get some information as far as the things that you're wanting to inventory. You also have the facilities manager, who's probably a lot less technical, is also thinking about the risk component of allowing these folks in to be able to do the things that they need to do and trying to protect his interests within his facility to keep it running. Then you're also talking to corporate IT guys who their interest is like, well, we need to know what all these assets are out here and the vulnerabilities related to them, and what is it do we really have out here and things of that nature in regards to functional risk, and potential projects where we could reduce that functional risk out there. And then you also might have some very upper level analyst, or even all the way up to a CISO level, that is thinking of the same type of probability. Well, probabilistic across my entire fleet, how does my cybersecurity aspect look at? So that's multiple different personas at multiple different levels that you're talking about. So you have to key yourself to that persona that you're talking to at that time. And sometimes you get a mixed room of them too.
But it all starts with that initial engagement with just the people who are boots on the ground, because, when it comes to that inventory and finding out what's out there, and stepping through the environment and, making sure that they're kind of, they'll have a level of awareness that they want. I've had some engagements where the customer is just like, look, here's everything, go nuts. Not in quite so few words as that, but, essentially they're very hands off, right? Like, it's just, okay, cool, you're set up. Here's all of our documentation, here's everything we know, go forward and find stuff and, just bring it in. And, those engagements can be sometimes very easy, especially if they're very standardized on a particular device type, and especially if it's the sort of device type that either doesn't need credentials or like has relatively easy to find default credentials that haven't been changed. I've been on a couple of engagements like that. And sure, yeah, you can, onboard a couple hundred devices in not much time at all, and then go back to them and be just like, here's everything I found. And they're like, that's what I was expecting, except for that one Windows XP computer over there. What's that doing there? But other times, they want to be more hands-on, and there's a lot of back and forth. And so you need to be able to just engage with, and again, yes, you do need to later on in the project, as you're presenting findings, as you're trying to move the relationship forward into other services that we can maybe offer, whether that's, network segmentation, managed services, whatever. You do need to be able to, or other people in the team need to be able to speak in the language of those other people, managers, executives, whoever. But when you're just dealing with the boots on the ground people, a lot of times it's, just, again, being able to speak their language in a way that's reassuring to them and keeping them in the loop to the degree that they want to be kept in the loop. And like I say, maybe sometimes they're very hands off, and maybe sometimes, they kind of want to know everything every step of the way. It's like, okay, cool, we're going to do a big fixation on that PC over there next. And have we found the credentials for that switch yet? Cool, let's plug that in. And so they really want to see all of that happening, and just being able to be comfortable with having those discussions and being able to field their questions. And like Andrew says, if something goes not the way it's expected, how do you speak to that? And then how do you work through that problem? So yeah, it's a lot. I mean, inventorying a network is mainly a technical consideration, but not purely a technical consideration, because you do have people that this environment that you're inventorying, the environment matters to them a great deal. And so you need to be able to really, as part of the process of finding what's out there, you do need to be able to also speak to them and keep them informed about what you're finding. And, going back to an earlier question, sometimes you find exactly what they're expecting and there's nothing else out there because they have a really good handle on what's out there. And sometimes, pace, I think Lance's earlier question, they're surprised by some of the things that pop up.
One of the things that's caught my attention here as we've been talking, and I've been listening to this, is the combination of the tools that, when you have somebody in the field sitting there inventorying that network, you have entire teams of people supporting them within the Verve organization. You've got my team and Drew's teams, which are trying to make new drivers or working to make new drivers if they're needed. We've got our development team, our testing teams, all sorts of different people that are back behind that. But then the people in the field themselves have to bring a wealth of knowledge and experience. Tyler, just hearing some of your stories is so great, but it's fascinating how that whole combination of the experience, the tools behind the scenes, the team supporting that, how it can all come together to be a successful deployment at a customer site.
A lot of phone a friend.
Absolutely. I have been on the receiving end of that more than once.
Oh, yeah. There's a ton of that out there, too. And I think some of that comes down to, like, we'll find a device and it'll just make enough on it to where we think it's going to talk with a specific driver. I just had that happen the other day where I had multiple different like Mark 6E cards, and they like were identifying themselves as like an ABB product. And I'm like, what the heck's going on here? So it got to digging around on it. I was like, yeah, it's an actual Mark 6E card, but the NIC manufacturer was by ABB or whatever, and it's talking the Mark 6E protocol out there, but there's some nuance with it that's not bringing back all the cheddar with it. So things like that happen all the time. It's trying to it's a little bit of everything when it comes down to it, like being able to, even to you guys, being able to convey what we're seeing in the field, to translate that into something more marketable out there. It's like what we're trying, collecting the log files for you and things of that nature to help it, really fill in the gap as far as what we're seeing compared to how things are acting out there.
Absolutely. I think it's a story of confidence in our abilities and confidence in our products, but still a willingness to grow and evolve as the environments change and as we discover new things.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, that seems as good a place to call it an episode for this week or for this month, because, geez, we've already been talking for an hour and I haven't even recorded the intros. So, yeah, that is kind of a very brief overview of what it's like to actually try and inventory an environment. And I mean, my takeaway is that, well, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. There's a lot of different ways, perhaps, to wind up going about it. But it really is an exercise in, both technical and people skills to establish that trust and set up the software and begin to actually find what's out there on a client network and communicate that with the client as you go. One thing that I did want to introduce just before we go is I'd like to introduce a new segment this season, a listener Q&A segment. And I won't do one for this episode because, well, we haven't actually solicited your questions. This is me doing that now. But the idea is that in these segments, we will take a question asked by you, our listeners, and just take a deep dive into it for about 5 minutes at the end of an episode with one or more subject matter experts from Verve who can best address whatever the subject of the question is. If you'd like to submit a question for us to answer in a future episode, head on over to the OT After Hours page at Libsyn. I will make sure there's a link in the show notes, and there will be a brand new contact page there that you can use to get in touch with us. So that's it for this month. You have been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Please share our episodes with your friends, family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octo Sound. Look them up if you need music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Rick. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.